Hey, welcome to Accidental Gods, to the podcast where we believe that another world is still possible, and that together we can make it happen. I'm Amanda Scott, and I spent the first series of this podcast laying out the basic toolkit that we think is essential to making conscious evolution a possibility. Now, in this second series, we've been seeking out the people who are using these tools, people with the experience and depth of practice to lead us to a future where humanity and the planet can flourish. My guest today is Sarah Schlote, on the line from Canada. Sarah's a psychotherapist and somatic experiencing practitioner with a huge depth of knowledge of both the theory and practice of what makes us tick. I first came across Sarah in an interview on the Whole Horse podcast, which is well worth listening to. There, she was able to make sense of horse behavior in ways I had never understood before. And she linked it to human behavior in ways that made me reevaluate a lot of my own experience. So when I wanted to bring ideas of poly-vagal theory and somatic experiencing and attachment rupture and repair to the podcast, I had a choice of either trying to learn it myself and then bringing to you what I'd read, or speaking with someone who lives in this world, who works with people every day, helping them to navigate life in ways that are generative and lead to flourishing. Sarah is one of the clearest, most knowledgeable people I could imagine, and we had a long, deep dive into the theory in this podcast. And the really good news is that by the end, we decided to set up another one so that we can go beyond this into the actual practical aspects of what you and I can do in our lives as we move forward from the coronavirus. So for this first part in what will be at least a 2-part podcast, please welcome Sarah Schlote. Sarah Schlote, welcome to Accidental Gods, and thank you for taking time out of what sounds like a very busy therapeutic practice, even in lockdown.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda, for this time. I'm really enjoying the opportunity to get to chat again.
Thank you. Yes, because we did do this before, and it timed badly because of the lockdown. So how is lockdown in Canada?
Well, it's interesting. I think, like in many places, there's a real variance in how people are responding. You have the people who are following the rules and the people who are resisting the rules, and you have the people who are, half-heartedly applying the rules. And I think that's true just about everywhere.
Is your government talking about raising lockdown sometime soon?
They've just loosened the restrictions around construction businesses and garden centers, I guess, because it's spring. A lot of people are in their homes with nothing to do, and it's springtime and it's the time to do gardening. And I think perhaps from a mental health standpoint, there was a good reason to make that available. That's at least my therapist's lens on perhaps why they loosened the restriction on that in particular.
Yeah. And plants are living things. And if you've been nurturing plants all winter ready to sell in the spring and you can't sell them, presumably they stop being saleable at some point. So, and you're right, everybody I know is trying to grow food now.
Yeah.
Which is good because I think there's going to be a worldwide food shortage by the autumn. So growing food, good thing. Anyway, back to track, because I have listened to you on mainly horse-related podcasts and been so struck by the clarity of your capacity to explain really quite complex concepts of neurophysiology and how they apply in the real world to people and horses. So most of the people listening to this are person-oriented rather than horse-oriented, though we do have quite a lot of crossover with Alex Kurland's Horses for Future, so there are some horse people, and we will go into some horse things. But first of all, I wondered, one of the many reasons I wanted to talk to you was that it saved me from doing an awful lot of reading about poly-vagal theory. I was on a worldwide webinar with Stephen last weekend that was run by Rebel Wisdom, and he was very clear about the need for finding safe space during lockdown, safety within. So I wondered if we could talk first about your take of what poly-vagal theory is and how it applies, and then we can look at how we can work with that during lockdown and beyond.
Absolutely. That would be a pleasure. And speaking to the horse piece, although I have gained a lot of visibility within the horse world, because that seems to be where I'm placing my passion and my attention, the majority of the time I'm in my office with clients and doing not course, related work. So I have this, this very visible stream in my life where I'm very much out there and, getting information to a broader audience. But most of my days when I'm seeing clients, it's human to human.
Right.
So I just haven't put as much focus on human to human exclusive things in my sort of social media visibility. So.
Okay, well, we can do that now. That would be good. So, polyvagal theory,
Yeah.
what is it? Why does it matter? Why do we need to know about it?
Sweet. Let's do that. I'll begin by saying this. Dr. Peter Levine, who is a longtime friend and collaborator of Dr. Stephen Porges, who created the polyvagal theory, Peter Levine will say that a map is not the terrain, but it sure helps you get around.
Sure.
And so the polyvagal theory in some ways is a map, a proposed map of the nervous system, and different from the one that most people know, a lot more nuanced and a lot more detailed. And what I'm going to offer today is almost like a simplified guide to the map of the polyvagal theory. So
Okay.
This is kind of like I'm the subway.
Like an underground map.
Yeah, I'm the subway or the underground map of which is an adaptation of the actual map, which is an adaptation of the terrain.
Brilliant.
Okay. Because it's a rather complex theory, but at the same time, it is super fascinating. And what Dr. Porges kind of realized was we don't just have two branches to our nervous system, stress response and relaxation response. It's a little bit more complex than that. I will spare you all the history of how that came about in terms of discovering that there's more to it than that. I'll just sort of launch into the theory itself. And the idea is that we actually have two branches for the parasympathetic nervous system.
Brilliant.
So parasympathetic would be what we call the relaxation response. It's kind of, again, a misnomer because it's more than just relaxation.
This is rest and digest.
Rest and digest and shutting down.
Okay, yes.
Right? Which is almost like this extreme form of relaxation, which isn't really relaxed.
Yeah.
It's like the relaxation response on overdrive. And so the parasympathetic nervous system, according to Dr. Stephen Porges, is highly mediated by the influence of the vagus nerve, which is the 10th cranial nerve. Now, of course, there's more going on that influences mammalian behavior, human, horse, or otherwise, than just the vagus nerve. So this is where I'll also speak to reductionism. And, let's not get caught up in the fact that the vagus is everything. But it's a really interesting theory, and I really quite like it because it speaks a lot to what we can do to help ourselves in our relationships, and especially during this pandemic.
Brilliant.
So the vagus nerve is thought to modulate the parasympathetic nervous system. It comes out of the brainstem, and it connects with all the nerves that innervate the organs and musculature involved in the face. So eyes and ears, hearing, mouth, vocalizations, larynx, pharynx, right, for sound, talking, and it goes down into the heart and lungs. And that would be what we call the ventral branch of the vagus nerve, or the ventral vagal complex. So basically what this does is it creates a face-heart connection. And so you can tell that somebody is having good ventral vagal tone because their facial expressions online, their eyes are bright and expressive. They're able to communicate. Voice comes easily, right? And and usually this happens when we feel safe in relationship, when we feel safe in our environments. And when we feel safe, what happens is that the cues, we take in these cues from our environment, from our relationships, we take them in through the parts of the body that are what Stephen Porges calls the social engagement system, right? The parts of us that are involved in social connection. That's also the parts of us that allow us to detect safety, danger, or life threat in our environment. The very parts of us that allow us to connect and communicate, also the parts that allow us to detect what's going on.
Our eyes and our ears and our senses. Okay.
Yeah. And it's coming in from these places. And vocalization also gives us a sense as to what's going on. Like you can tell if someone's stressed or distressed or calm based on vocalization. And so as we take in this information through the social engagement system, that will tell the nervous system if I'm feeling safe or not. If I'm feeling safe, what that does is it lights up the ventral branch of the vagus nerve, which acts as a pacemaker on the heart. The ventral branch of the vagus connects with the sinoatrial node on the heart, which is this little pacemaker that we have that keeps the rhythm going. And so when we're feeling safe, because of what we're taking in through social engagement, through our senses, that will slow our heart down so that we can remain in safe connection.
Right.
It modulates our nervous system for us. So this is what we might call a really gentle brake system.
Yes, and so I'm thinking it also connects to the gut and moves blood to the gut and gets us more into the digest phase as well.
Yes. So this is the part of the dorsal branch. So this is the second branch of the vagus nerve.
Oh, is it? Right.
So the first branch of the vagus would be the ventral vagus. So this is supra-diaphragmatic or above the diaphragm. So basically all the organs and bits and stuff that are located above the diaphragm, which are involved in social connection.
Right. Yep.
We don't usually use our legs involved in social connection, right? We don't usually use our feet. We usually use these other upper parts of us involved in social.
Right.
So the other branch that you're talking about, which is the other part of the parasympathetic nervous system, or what we call the relaxation response, is the dorsal vagal response or the dorsal vagal complex. The dorsal branch of the vagus nerve is largely, not entirely, but largely subdiaphragmatic or under the diaphragm. So it too comes out of the, it's part of the vagus. It kind of wanders far and wide. It starts at the top and then, but largely goes down below and connects the heart and everything above with the gut and the viscera and the colon and all sorts of things.
Right.
And so when we're feeling safe, the dorsal branch of the vagus nerve will be on what we call low, or the terminology we'll hear is low tone dorsal response.
Okay.
Low tone dorsal response is when, like you said, rest and digest, right? It's a very restorative state. It's the state that we're in usually when we're breastfeeding or we're napping or, we're reading a book perhaps, or we're just, if you're into yoga, you're at the end of your yoga class lying in shavasana. Corpse pose, that would be, for many people, a low tone dorsal response. We hope.
Yeah.
For some people, stillness is not calm, and we'll get to that perhaps in a little bit. Low tone branch of the nervous system is also a very highly restorative state. It's when we have tissue repair, things start to go back to working properly. This is when we restore and replenish. And so these are states that are really, really important to have as well. And that too would be considered a soft break on the nervous system.
Right.
And these branches develop as a result of us learning in the world that we feel safe. And how do we first start learning in the world that we feel safe? It's usually because we have to rely on the nervous systems of our caregivers to help us feel safe. Right? When we're small, we don't really have a really good self-regulation capacity when we're very little. We rely on the nervous systems of the caregivers to provide us with that, what we call co-regulation.
Can you say a little bit more about co-regulation, what it is and how it arises?
Yeah, I'll give you an example to make it really practical. So you of course have been around your dogs or your horses. I'm assuming you have dogs as well as
I do.
So have you ever had a moment where you're with one of your animals and you start to relax, your breath releases a little bit, and then the dog or the horse, its breath releases?
Yes, I'm working on that with my mare at the moment, exactly that. Yes.
Yeah. And then the animal releases, and then in response to its releasing, you release further.
Yeah, and you get that gorgeous, peaceful cycle where you can just watch the horizon and be relaxed and chilled.
Exactly it. So that would be what we call, that's a beautiful example of co-regulation.
Right.
A teacher of mine, Kathy Kane, likes to call it pinging off each other.
Right.
Like sonar, right? Where it's like, oh, I ping and you ping and we ping off each other.
And the opposite also happens of if I get tense, then she gets tense. And then we ping off each other the other way.
You're correct. That would no longer be co-regulation, but co-dysregulation.
Okay, right. That makes sense.
We could say co-activation and co-deactivation, right? We're activating together and we're deactivating or settling together. Right? And co-regulation occurs, for most mammals, occurs as a result of these early interactions with our caregivers, usually the mother. But obviously in this modern society, it's not always the mother. Sometimes it can also be our whoever the family members are that are raising us, if it's adoptive family, foster family, extended family members, if we're being raised in a community. Animals, often it's in a herd or a pack setting, right? So we co-regulate off of the nervous systems that are around us. And so ideally in our early experiences, we're going to have, an external nervous system or a series of external nervous systems whose ability to respond accurately to the current conditions is reliable enough that we know that we can respond off of their response. And so what I mean by that is this. So if my caregiver has what Stephen Porges would call faulty neuroception, and what a colleague of mine in Australia, Rebecca Wheatley, has retermed misattuned neuroception to be more trauma-informed, because faulty makes it sound like it's a defective. And so I appreciate her reframe on that. So if an individual, let's say a parent, has misattuned neuroception, they have their own history of adversity or trauma, and they happen to be particularly anxious in the world, right? Even if objectively from the outside there's nothing to be anxious about, but that particular person's nervous system has evolved to be more on the hyper-aroused end of the spectrum. Then as a little infant, I'm going to be responding off of that external nervous system.
Right.
And my nervous system starts to go, oh, there's something to feel unsafe about. And even if my brain is telling me, oh no, everything is fine, the nervous system is giving another story. And so we can learn to have misattuned neuroception in a really innocent way from caregivers who have just been through their own stuff.
Wow.
It doesn't have to always be because of abuse or neglect or trauma, right? It can be past generations' experiences that influence caregivers, and then caregivers' nervous systems show up in a particular way, and then the infant pings off of that.
Yes.
And then we see co-dysregulation.
So this is possibly taking us down a rabbit hole, but I'm really interested, so we're going to go down it. So I read a lot about epigenetics, where, for instance, if you take a mother rat who is really good at raising her baby rats,
yes,
then she raises baby rats that are also very good and very calm and very quiet. And if you take the hyperactive, dysregulated, let's say, mother rat, she raises dysregulated baby rats. If you swap them over, then the baby rats take on the patterning of the mother rat. But the paper I was reading went on to suggest that there is an epigenetic change, so that then if you take one of those baby rats, it's the generations thereafter will be genetically different. And I am wondering how much of this, so this is back to nature versus nurture, if what you're saying is that a child or a baby rat or a foal or a puppy or whatever picks up the level of regulation or lack of regulation of the main caregiver, and that then changes the genetics. It's not that the genes are being passed on, it's that the behavior is passed on, and then that is expressed in epigenetic terms. Is that a distinction that makes sense? And then is that something that you've looked at?
Yeah, and I'm not an expert on epigenetics, but I do have a sense of the literature in terms of what they've seen is that the genes don't change, but the expression of the genes changes in future generations. Right? And that gene expression, it's almost like a switch that gets turned on or off.
Yeah.
Right. And so the gene is there, but whether or not it's turned on or off will be the change that gets passed down through the future generations based on my understanding of it. And so what we start to see is this interesting confluence of nature and nurture, because you can't really separate them out.
Right.
Because there are the immediate impacts of environment and relational attunement or lack of attunement and co-dysregulation, so to speak, or lack of safe haven conditions, if we were to talk about attachment theory, all these things that create, the nurture experience of a particular organism in present time. But that current nurture experience is also sitting on and being influenced by the epigenetic experiences and intergenerational experiences of the caregivers who are passing that along.
Yeah.
So the infant has the epigenetic, or potentially has the epigenetic changes on top of the nurture experience of environment that is in part due to those epigenetic changes.
Right.
And so you really can't, to me, you can't really separate them out. I remember earlier on in psychology where we used to talk about, is the child a clean slate, a blank slate when they come into the world? Is it nature? Is it nurture? And I'm like, all of it. I think that's a bit of a false dichotomy now, that we know about epigenetics.
Right. Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And from the craniosacral work, I've just started to study that. They would claim that from conception, we are being affected by the regulation or dysregulation of the mother. And so you're not even a clean slate at the moment you're born.
Yeah.
The clean slate might happen at the moment of conception, and then we could discuss that, but that's a very different rabbit hole. So let's carry on. I'm sorry, I interrupted what was a very clean flow of explaining how it all arises.
It's a lovely little diversion because it actually does come back around in a really nice way, because this is going to link us into the pandemic really nicely.
Yes.
So I'm actually glad that you invited that little diversion for a moment. Let's come back to co-regulation. So this idea of co-regulation, and again, I also want to say this to all our listeners, it's going to sound like mother bashing, and that is not the goal. This is not the point, because here's the thing too. My point is not to gaslight all the mums or female identifying individuals who have carried children, to be inclusive, who may be feeling targeted by this information. This research has focused on the quote unquote mother because it is the infant that is in the mother's womb. And so therefore there's a particular influence, but that's not to say that the mother is to blame. Again, mothers or female identifying mother figures have had experiences that are not necessarily their faults. And so I would hate to come across as if we're gaslighting mothers, female identifying mother figures for, what's happened to their offspring, because they did the best they could given their own circumstances, and they didn't know what they didn't know. And so it's not about blame here, but it's a tricky line to walk around. How can we recognize the factors that have led to difficulties while also not falling into shame and blame?
Sure, because everybody does their best. I am absolutely reminded of Philip Larkin, who's an English poet, who had one of his most famous lines is, "They fuck you up, your mum and dad. They didn't mean to, but they did." And that, of course, that's the nature of life, is every parent is doing their best most of the time, and it's either good enough or it's not, but that's not because they weren't trying. And then it's up to us as we grow to build on what they gave us, I guess.
That's right. Well, and to grieve what we didn't get, and to work through the rage, the suppressed rage of attachment shock, and the bits and pieces that felt misattuned or that were not okay. Like that becomes the work we have to do. Yeah. So I just wanted to name that for your audiences to, as we talk about this topic, it is really easy to feel judged or blamed. And that's certainly not where I'm coming from about this topic. But I
think one of the things that really strikes me about this is that our generation has the tools to talk about this and to begin to repair ourselves. And certainly my mother's generation really didn't.
Yes.
So we are extraordinarily lucky, because they inherited generation after generation after generation of, if you look back at the lives our ancestors lived, they were very, very hard. And we are the generation that can choose to heal ourselves and have the potential to have the resources for that. So we are astonishingly lucky in that regard. And we have you to talk us through it. So let's keep going.
Let's do that. So if I come back around to these fictional optimal scenario where, we receive good enough co-regulation, good enough attunement, not perfect. It's not meant to be perfect, right? But that, that enough of the time we were responded to in our cries, somebody came, we were able to be around other nervous systems and feel safe. We felt protected, and when we feel safe and protected and attuned to and responded to in an accurate enough way, or the mistakes that are made are repaired in a genuine way, when that happens, we develop a sense of secure attachment. We develop a sense of safety. And when we feel safe, our brains and our bodies develop appropriately, right? Our brains and our bodies can allocate energy towards proper development and not spend all the energy on survival. And so when we have this beautiful co-regulation process within what we call safe haven conditions in our early lives, then that allows us to go out into the world and explore the world from a place of secure base. So the parent or the caregiver, even, a foal's mom, or the foal's herd, for instance, the foal, the child will leave and go out in the world and explore and be creative and experiment and have adventures, and then come back to the secure base of the caregiver or the herd, for soothing, for protection, for reassurance, for nurturing, for nourishment when needed, and then go back out again into the world. And we have this ability to develop this kind of competence and confidence because of our early experience of feeling safe in the world and having a nervous system that we can rely on and having external nervous systems we can trust. So here's where things get messy. That's not always true.
Right.
And where it gets messy is, we talked about misattuned neuroception. So when the caregivers, by no fault of their own, were not available, were struggling themselves, didn't realize, tried to follow external advice that actually wasn't good advice,
Yeah.
did the best they could with their parenting, or sometimes external circumstances like a child has to be hospitalized at a really young age and isn't able to be with their caregiver. There's separations or,
Right.
early surgeries or, being born premature or whatever. There's all these different things that happen that can interrupt this process that can lead to these early experiences of overwhelm and unsafety. It's not always, again, overt neglect and abuse, although that can be true.
Yeah.
But when we have those kinds of experiences, our nervous systems learn very, very young, even in the womb, I'm not safe.
Right.
And so, especially if our early experiences, if we come back around to the vagus nerve, if we did not have an external social engagement system to act as our soft brake so that when we have our cries, our protests, and we're in that loud cry for connection and for reassurance, because that's all we have as infants. And let's say no one comes. All you have as an infant is a high amount of sympathetic gas pedal, right? High amount of activation, and no real way to shut it down with a soft brake. There's no low tone dorsal without a caregiver there to provide it. There's no ventral vagal available unless there's a caregiver there to provide it. And so the only ability people have to relax or to settle at these very young ages is to go into shutdown, which is what we call high tone dorsal vagal response.
Right.
And so that's like, when we don't have low tone, I don't feel safe. I can't really rest and digest. No one's coming. I've got a high amount of sympathetic activation. There's no external social engagement system to help me settle and soothe. Then I'm going to shut down. And we see this in non-human animals too.
Yeah, I'm just thinking how many shut down horses, and somehow I've listened to you talk about this many times, and it hadn't really sunk home that high tone ventral vagal is what leads to the shutdown. Lights on,
Or
nobody
dorsal
home.
vagal.
Look, sorry, dorsal vagal. I wrote it down wrong.
Yeah.
Okay, right.
High
Yes.
tone dorsal. Yeah, because this is like the relaxation response on overdrive is the high tone dorsal response, right? It's like rest and digest, but too much of it. If I were to like simplify
And
it
this
down.
becomes the freeze and the fiddle about and all of the different ways that and the lights on, nobody home, shut down look. There are many different
Yeah,
ways of that demonstrating, I guess.
so fiddle about, or what we might call the fidget response, would not really occur in freeze per se.
Okay.
If and I can provide some graphs. I don't know if, Amanda, you have a website where we can put
Yes,
resources.
definitely, yes.
I will send some graphs for people to download that come along with this that I think help explain this really well.
Brilliant. Thank you.
And so if we think about it, so let's go back to, I'll explain what I mean by just backing it up just a moment. So we have these three states, right? So according to Porges, we have the neuroception of safety. And when we feel safe, there are particular behaviors and functions that feeling safe supports us to be able to experience. Right. And then when we feel a sense or perceive or neurocept a sense of danger, then that is going to lead to particular behaviors and particular states that are in relation to that or neuroception of danger. And then if we have a neuroception of life threat, then we're going to have particular behaviors again and state shifts that reflect that neuroception.
So life threat and danger are separate states.
According to Porges, now we're not talking about the layperson definition of danger and life threat. Layperson definition, people often interpret those as the same thing, right? But in the poly-vagal theory, danger would be, so safety would be, let's go through this, let's imagine this like a curve, a bell curve.
Yep.
So on the extreme left of the bell curve, we're going to start off in a neuroception of safety. So neuroception of safety, there are particular states that are available to us when we feel safe, right? Social connection, rest and digest, and even things that are what Porges calls blended states. So this is what's really cool about the poly-vagal theory, is that these three branches of the nervous system are kind of like dials. They fluctuate to varying degrees at the same time. It's not just stress is on, relaxation is off, relaxation is on, stress is off. It's not so black and white. Okay. All three branches are fluctuating all the time in terms of their function. And so when we're in a neuroception of safety, what you might see is, again, low tone dorsal. That's pretty much, a lot of low tone dorsal, not a lot of social engagement, not a lot of, sympathetic. Then we might have the social engagement. So that might be, spending quiet time together, social connection, various types of things there. And then we might have a blended state, such as the ventral vagal response with a little bit of sympathetic charge. And that kind of state might be play. right?
Right.
Might be
Yeah.
healthy sex, might be, where we've got the sympathetic nervous system, the gas pedal is on, right? Because we need it for activity, movement,
Hmm.
whatever. But the ventral vagus response comes in and slows the heart rate down so that I can feel safe and not go into panic because of the stress response.
Right. Right. So
Mhm.
that's when you get into that kind of flow state when I'm climbing rocks or something where I'm scared enough for it to be interesting, but not so scared that I can't actually hang on to the
Yeah,
rock.
there's a great example of that, right? And that might be and that's hard to pinpoint where that might be on the graph, but I definitely agree that would be a blended state. That there is enough of something available to be able to experience the experience as exhilarating or enjoyable.
So we got our bell curve, we got
So
our
we've got our bell
safety
curve,
way to the left.
safety. That's right. Yeah. So we're in safety. And so then as we start to a sense of danger for whatever reason, right? Then we start to do what I believe Jackson back in the 1880s coined the term dissolution. And so our response to feeling unsafe typically will start with our most evolutionary, most recent response first. And as those responses are not available, we go to the next oldest one and then the next oldest one, and then culminating in the most primitive one as all those response options become either unavailable or unsuccessful.
Wow.
Okay. And so as we leave the safety kind of part of our graph and we start to go up the bell curve, we end up in a neuroception of danger. So while in a neuroception of danger, people will often think, oh, that's fight or flight. And I go, yeah, you're right. And if we think evolutionarily speaking with the poly-vagal theory, we have this beautiful social engagement system. The
Hmm.
ventral vagal branch still shows up when we feel a neuroception of danger and will influence particular response patterns. And we like to call those find and fawn.
Ha.
Uh-huh.
Find and fun. Can we unpick those a little bit?
Yeah. So the find response is when I try to seek out my herd or my caregivers for support,
Okay.
protection, nourishment, reassurance, etc. We're looking for the supports to come. We're trying to call our mums, our dads, our parents, our herds
Yeah.
to us. And so the find response often can come first because that is like, oh, I'm looking for the safety. I'm looking for what's going to be protective for me in this moment. And that is social engagement.
Right.
When there are no safe organisms around us, so when the individual is abusive or harmful or misattuned, or we've kind of written them off as being incompetent, like sometimes they're there, sometimes they're not, and we kind of have this sort
Unreliable.
of unreliable attachment, right?
Yeah.
Like this, like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, you're kind of great, but not all the time, so I can't really trust you, and oh yeah, you were there for me sometimes, but not these other times, and so therefore I'm not letting you in,
Hmm.
kind of experience. So when we have a perception that the supports around us, whether individual or communal, are not available, then we would try to defuse tension and risk of harm by going into fawn. So fawn would consist of all these appeasement responses that we get into to try to, reduce the risk of harm by trying to tend and befriend the enemy.
Right.
And so that's a whole category of responses there, the fawn response.
Yeah, and you can see that all around
Mhm.
us in so
Mhm.
many social circumstances. I would think, particularly in politics, we watch
Mhm.
that happening all of the time.
Mhm.
Scary.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so we have this thing that happens, and so we have find and fawn, and sometimes neither options are available. And sometimes we'll go into fight or flight or flight or fight. Often we flee, and if we can't flee, we fight back because,
Hmm.
we often fight when we're trapped. That can often be the response that occurs. And then fidget, I would place fidget as occurring either in the safety area of the graph, because we can fidget when we are excitedly anticipating something like a birthday party, and I'm walking around and I'm pacing and I'm
Yeah.
playing with my objects because I can't wait,
Yeah. Yeah.
So we fidget. Fidget would be those like sort of little displacement type behaviors that we notice, that, are evidence of energy that we don't really quite know what to do with.
Right.
And so fidget, and when we feel safe, is, like you're bored and you're like, clicking a pen because you're bored, right? Like
Mm.
there's no neuroception of danger. I'm just bored but safe. Yeah, so
And
we
certainly
fidget.
not a neuroception of life threat, because we tend not to fidget when it in life-threatening circumstances.
Exactly. At that point, something else altogether is happening, right? So this is where the state and the neuroception predict the behavior or determine the behavior. So neuroception of danger, fidget responses can happen here as well. So especially when we're not able to flee or we're not able to fight, either because we're confined, right? We're caged, we're in lockdown, we are, kept in small spaces. This is often true for non-human animals in our modern society, right? With dogs kept in crates and horses kept in
Yeah.
stalls, and animals in the food production industry and in the entertainment industry and zoos and
It is.
on and on and
Yeah.
on. Right?
That pacing tiger that we've all seen somewhere in
Yes.
our lives. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. And so the and the pacing elephant all alone in its enclosure because there's no
Mm.
social engagement, right? So
Mm.
we talk about enrichment for animals, and I go, there's enrichment, and it's like what neurobiologically, it's what opportunities are we offering them to be able to seek and have social engagement and wake up the ventral vagus,
Yeah.
right? Because the enrichment often involves environmental enrichment, which is usually sounds and smells and things like
And
sensory
toys
stuff,
to play with.
toys
Yeah.
to play with, but not even just toys, but like the ability to roam and like
Yeah.
engage with nature and engage with a herd. And that's all waking up the ventral vagus. I mean, that's all
Yeah.
ventral vagal stimulation,
Yep.
right? So I kind of go, wow, so when we feel danger, but we can't actually do anything to stop it, fidget responses start to show up. So this is where we start to see things like addictions, obsessive compulsive responses, intellectualizing, deflecting, projecting, suppression, like with horses, you'll see like stall weaving and crib biting and wind sucking and, other animals like bar chewing and pulling at skin and pulling at hair and ripping feathers out. And like these would be these fidget responses that
Right.
represent this energy towards either wanting to fight or to flee. And it's not just fleeing the source of danger, it's also moving in the direction of what I want. It's moving towards nourishment, moving towards social connection, moving towards fun and freedom and forage, right? And
Right.
so when we can't do those things, when we can't act on our need for connection, our need for nourishment, when we can't fight, we can't flee, when we can't find and fawn is useless also, then we fidget. Like fidget happens when we're not able to really enact a very particularly useful response.
So
And as
lockdown is going to be full of fidgeting people in one way or another.
Yes, yes. And I forget if this was before you hit record or not, Manda, but we were talking about how there are so many people buying puppies right now because they're stuck
Yes.
in lockdown.
Yes.
And almost as this sort of way to try to wake up their ventral vagal systems, like, oh
Right.
my gosh, I'm feeling so isolated. I need something to not just give me a sense of purpose, but for co
Yeah.
regulation and for
Yeah.
play and for all these things that we can't do.
Yeah.
And in some ways, is it fidget? In some ways, is it trying to, get the social engagement system back?
And that's why puppies, because more than anything else, dogs give us that unconditional
Oh,
positive
yeah,
regard. They just love to be with us.
that's right. And
And we
so then
love to
what?
be loved.
Yes. Oh, I like how you said that. Yeah, we love to be loved. But
Yeah.
then what's going to happen at the end of the pandemic
No.
when, you
No.
know, all these puppies end up needing homes because, people are
Yeah.
going to go back to work and then we're going to have a bunch of dogs who don't know how to tolerate being by themselves
Maybe
because
we won't go back to work.
maybe
Maybe
we
we'll
won't.
manage to create an economic system that does not require that people go off and do their bullshit jobs they didn't want to do in the first place. That would be very cool. Our government, this is a
That
complete
would be.
aside, but our government
Yeah.
is trying to end lockdown on Monday,
Oh my gosh.
and they're going to cut back all of the money that they've been giving because, quotes, they believe the nation is becoming addicted to
What?
the money that the government's handing out. And I think you could reframe that as people are really enjoying the life that they've got now, and they were not really enjoying it before. And maybe your role as government is to work out how to help people enjoy their lives.
Yeah.
It's not the way they think, but it's an interesting,
Mm.
yeah,
Well, and it's interesting because it speaks to the topic of basic income, like a guaranteed
sure.
basic income,
Yes.
based off of tax. And what they've found in places where they've piloted basic guaranteed basic income is not that people are more lazy and less likely to
Mhm.
work. They're actually more motivated to work because their basic needs are cared for.
Yeah. And they can be creative.
They
They
can be
can do the stuff
creative.
they want to do.
That's
Yeah.
right. And no one has had the guts to actually implement this in a major way because they're like, well, it's costing us money. They have no idea down the road how much money they'll save in terms of mental health care costs and hospital costs, and unemployment costs as a result of paying everybody a basic income, because that supports the whole society to function better.
Yeah.
And then when we're functioning better, or our health is better. And you know what I mean? Like, they're not seeing the long-term potential impacts. They're just going, well, we're seeing short-term expense without the long-term goal. But that's a whole other topic.
But we could do it. Let's do that some other day. Yes.
So let's come back. Okay. So we have the neuroception of danger. So we're going up our graph here, right? And then when all our best attempts at surviving are not super effective, then or they're not available, right? Then we go into the neuroception of life threat. Now, how Porges describes this is typically this state of overwhelm where I'm either so overwhelmed that I'm going to die. And that often is in young children, for instance, the overwhelm that is felt when we are not soothed. And our emotions are just so big and so tremendous, and the misattunements or the experiences coming from our caregivers are so big, and we're so little that can create this existential experience of, I can't handle this. Like it's like this wordless, nameless sense of overwhelm. So that can be what we call life threat, but life threat also can refer to like literally physical life threat. Like, I'm falling unconscious, I'm being choked, I'm lacking oxygen, I'm about to die. Like, there can be that component too. Okay. Also in young childhood, also like early near-death experiences or near-death experiences throughout life would be that experience of life threat.
And so some of these are an experience of life threat that feels life-threatening, in which there is probably not an actual threat to our lives, and others we are actually in danger of dying.
And so this is where it's so interesting, because to a small infant, being in an incubator, not being held for 3 months, you don't know if you're going to live or die. Right? That's a very existentially precarious state. And so there's no logic on board when you're an infant.
Sure.
We don't have a really highly developed prefrontal cortex that can think.
Your amygdala just goes into total panic.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Wow.
And we see that in the brains of people who've experienced these early traumas or these early adversities, is that the amygdalas are much larger.
Right.
In individuals who have experienced a lot of early fear and early overwhelming experiences. And so life threat, according to poly-vagal theory, would be these experiences of overwhelm that lead to shutdown.
Right.
And so whether or not it's actually true life threat, like as a grown-up today, you might not have an actual life threat, but the nervous system is picking up on something that is very reminiscent to an earlier experience and will play out the same pattern.
And is this also linked to, I know from my own past experience in therapy and people I've spoken to, I get to the point where I feel that if I take the lid off my emotions, I will never be able to get it back on again, and it will be in some way destructively catastrophic. And this sounds like tapping back into that sense of life threat as an adult at the point where we're approaching that, emotional edge.
That's right. And what Peter Levine talks about as somatic experiencing was a trauma recovery method that Dr. Levine created that is very, very much, I call it practical poly-vagal theory, or poly-vagal theory in practice. And basically it is essentially how to work with some of these overwhelming states without getting overwhelmed, and building the window of tolerance to be able to work through some of this stuff and do what Peter calls renegotiation, which is, let's not relive it and get you overwhelmed and get you shutting down again, because that's kind of a pointless sequence to keep reenacting, but let's see if we can have a different experience of it. And there's SC, and there's all these offshoot trainings that either evolved out of somatic experiencing or draw in a large part from somatic experiencing. I'm reminded of somatic resilience and regulation. I'm reminded of deep brain reorienting, Frank Corrigan out of the UK. There's all these methods that kind of draw from or evolved out of SC, which work with these states and how to work with these states in a safer way by titrating into them or going into little bits at a time. But that, again, is a whole other topic.
Yes. I so want to do that, but not just now. Let's go back. Yes.
Let's go back. Yeah. So this could be a multi-part series, and I'm happy to make this a multi-part series if you like.
Thank you.
this graph, right? So we have this graph. And then, of course, if we come down the other side of this bell curve, as we come out of these shutdown responses, which, I tend to refer to as freeze, fold, faint, feign death, and fragment. So freeze is that like shut down, or what we call tonic immobility or rigid immobility, where we've got one foot on the gas and one foot on the brakes at the same time. Right? It's like I'm all revved up with nowhere to go. Yeah. That would be freeze. Fold is what we sometimes call the collapsed response or collapsed immobility, floppy immobility, right? Where there's no muscle tone.
So the kind of kitten response. So you pick up the kitten and it just hangs faint. Yeah.
Yeah. And what's interesting is you can have floppy immobility, however, when you have a neuroception of safety. So floppy immobility, so there's immobility with fear, which is at the top end of this graph, and then there's immobility without fear on the bottom end. So immobility without fear is the low tone dorsal vagal response.
So is that the yoga? Right. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's one that we might choose, because I have in red in my notes further up, stillness is not always calm, stroke safe, stroke good. So this is fold.
Fold would be the collapse response. When it's like nothing else is working and I can't. It's just the I can't response is so strong and it's coupled with fear. So this is Porges calling this immobility with fear.
Right.
And there's this sort of shutdown, collapse, surrender kind of response. That would be the collapse where there's no muscle tone. I'm just floppy. I'm just out, giving up. It's kind of that defeat, extreme defeat, learned helplessness kind of place.
Yes. So many horses.
Oh, so many horses and people and dogs. And we go around and that just becomes the way of it.
Right.
And then fragment is another addition I like to put up there. Fragment refers to this really extreme form of personality fragmentation or really extreme forms of dissociation. Dissociation can occur up here in these high states of life threat, but also can occur when we're feeling danger, like, when you kind of disconnect and go into a blind rage. That would be an example of like mild dissociation or moderate dissociation while in neuroception of life threat. And then we dissociate when we feel safe too. Right? When we're daydreaming, for instance.
Okay.
Or when you're driving your car and you don't remember the last 4 intersections.
Okay. And are those neurologically, because I'm thinking then everything that falls under the realm of shamanic dreaming would count as dissociation, but I'm guessing that neurophysiologically there's probably different stuff happening.
Well, and I'd be curious. I don't know how far we've gotten with looking at the neurophysiology of meditators. I mean, I'm sure there's some literature on doing MRIs of people who are in meditative states. In fact, I believe people have done this.
Yeah, gamma. They end up with a lot of gamma if you go really deep. So you go through theta, then delta, then gamma. But I don't know beyond that what the neurochemistry is.
And no, and I'd be very curious.
Yeah.
But this is where this is a map and not the terrain.
Sure.
Right? So this is where I'm not I sound intelligent because I can talk about this stuff. But when you go into GABA and theta, I'm like, I don't know, you lost me. Like, I know those are brainwaves and that's about it.
Okay.
Like I don't know all the neurochemicals. I don't know all the neurophysiology. I know some of it, but I know I rely more on the map of the terrain as opposed to knowing all the ins and outs of the terrain.
Sure. And then recognizing when these things are happening with people in front of you, which is probably more important than knowing whether they're in beta or delta or gamma.
Totally. So, that's why I love the map, right? And that's why, some evolutionary biologists will shoot down the poly-vagal theory and go, well, there's some aspects of it that have been disproven and da-da-da. And I go, yeah, but the map itself that it creates is really super predictive and helpful,
right.
And that's what matters to me is, can I actually use it and have it be useful and effective and practical, which it is. So, it's kind of like the triune brain model where, that idea of, that was debunked decades
but it's
ago.
Still useful. It's still a useful little map. I still teach it with the coda. This is not exactly what's happening, but it's very useful to imagine. Exactly. I'm aware that we have about 5 minutes left before you have to go and see another client. So what I'd really like to do is have a look at how people in lockdown, which is probably still going to be obtaining when we release this, we're in a circumstance which is unusual. I'm really interested in what happens to small children when the parents, the caregivers are in lockdown. That might be a different podcast. But the people listening, most of whom are to some degree constrained in what they can do, there's a degree of sense of danger. I would suspect that quite a lot of us are in the neuroception of danger phase at different points of the day.
Yeah.
And that it would probably be good if we had strategies to help bring us into a sense of safety Because actually there are no tigers outside the window. It's just that the world's gone a bit weird.
And the tiger is the COVID virus, right?
Yeah.
Like there is a tiger. It's just invisible.
Yeah.
It's a tiny tiger that acts like glitter. It's invisible glitter. You can't see it, and you don't know how to best respond.
Yeah.
And so here's this perfect storm of we have a threat, a danger in the environment. None of us can see it. And so we're all feeling this desired amount of response. And yet at the same time, the environmental cues are not there. And so we're getting this conflicting information that says, oh, I'm safe, but the world is telling me I'm in danger. And then you're going to have people who are going to contest that. You've got the people right now who are like, oh, I want to go back and get my hair cut. This whole protest around.
And meanwhile, I'll just drink bleach and I'll be fine. Yes.
Yeah, and all the conspiracy theories. And I go, well, how much of that, though, is misattuned neuroception, where we're getting conflicting information? We're seeing nothing has physically changed in the world, but we've got this invisible glitter problem, right? These invisible tigers running around that we can't see, but that we're told are there. And if you have misattuned neuroception to start with, it becomes very, very complicated. And especially if you've learned to shut down your fear response. Because a lot of people will go into, well, everyone's overreacting. I don't care who dies. But underneath that sort of cold, cavalier kind of response is actually a lot of fear and terror.
Right.
And so, and that's how somebody can often go into these kinds of reactions around why are we still doing this? Why can't we just release ourselves into society? If you've had any kind of past experience in your life where you were shut down, told to do something beyond that was not what you wanted to do, you were made to go along with what other people said, and how you found power in your life was to connect with your fight response, then what we're seeing a lot of, I predict, is the people who are fighting this pandemic response are the people who may actually have in their history some form of thwarted fight response or a shutdown response where they have learned to shut off empathy and judge others and judge themselves as a way of protecting against feeling things like fear and shame and disconnection and loss.
So a lot of our politicians, particularly in the UK, and I'm thinking around the world, are men who are sent away to boarding school at a very young age. And boarding school is notoriously brutal. And they will have, one way or another, had to shut down. And so therefore they are now faced with a response that requires more emotional flexibility than they are capable of bringing to bear.
That's right. And they're associating their response with extreme logic. But the extreme logic is, again, it's emotional reasoning masked as logic, and we trust the logic of it. But it's the same within North America also, right? Trump's history of early developmental difficulties is well known. People have written about this in terms of his early family origin and how early he learned how to shut down and not show emotion. So, we know that the connections between this, and we're seeing it play out on a very global stage.
Right.
But when I think about something practical for everyone to take away from today is, I think first off would be, one, really just having compassion for just how confusing it is for your nervous system right now. Okay. This is a very, very difficult time. These are unprecedented times. The last time we went through this was the Spanish flu about 100 years ago. And so most of us, the majority of humans on this planet do not have lived experience with pandemics. Yep. And as you said earlier, Amanda, that said, epigenetically, if we have ancestors who did go through scary times like the Spanish flu, like the Great Depression, like a Holocaust, and who have been exposed to these global conditions of fear and terror and danger and potential life threat, there can actually still be things written in our genes that have been turned on or turned off as a result of our ancestors' past experiences of similar situations globally, that are playing out right now. So the responses that are happening for people can either reflect a trigger response based on their own adversity earlier in their childhoods, or can be an epigenetic intergenerational response pattern that we're seeing. Yep. And so under these conditions of stress, it's a little bit of a free for all. Everyone's nervous systems are kind of all over the place, which is why people are saying, be really gentle. Don't try to be overproductive while you're not working. It's okay to feel really sleepy, because that could be that dorsal response.
Yeah. Yep. And are we not just? I don't know about you, but I have spent an awful lot of time sleeping recently.
Yeah.
And I don't think that I'm particularly stressed, but my goodness, I get tired in the middle of the day.
Well, and see, what's interesting for me is, and I think this is perhaps true of other mental health workers, some people are calling that there's going to be a secondary kind of silent pandemic or epidemic, loosely calling it that, which is basically all the mental health workers having to deal with the fallout of this, both now and after this is all over. Because right now, while the frontliners are the medical doctors and the nurses and the people in the hospitals who are providing medical care, once this is all passed, us as therapists are still the ones who are going to have to continue to pick up the pieces and now treat the doctors and the nurses for their trauma collectively from having had to go through all of this. And so, and we're already feeling it. So we're this silent population of people who are actually quite overworked right now that are not really fully being acknowledged.
And there's no light at the end of that tunnel because this could go on a long time. So what could we do just before you have to go? People listening, is there anything they can do to self-help that will take the pressure off the therapists?
Yeah, well, and also just for themselves too. Just for themselves too, right? Like I'm not saying the whole world has to accommodate the therapist, because that's of course a bit of a role reversal as well that I would not want to encourage. But at the same time, if we're all looking out for each other, I think to myself, okay, one, be curious about your nervous system state. Be gentle with the fact that these are trying times, and based on your own experience, whether you have past history of abuse or neglect, which is getting triggered today in terms of fear of lack, fear of dying, fear of loss, anger at being told what to do. All these responses are going to be coming up now in full force. And co-regulation is going to be so important to try to cultivate as best as we can. We're seeing a lot of co-dysregulation in couples right these days, and we can attribute that to being off of work and being in the home. Domestic violence rates have gone up significantly, because we're at home. So this pattern of co-dysregulation based on the neuroception of unsafety is huge and tremendous right now.
And we're being fed war metaphors at a time that completely inappropriate, which is guaranteed pretty much to trigger in some people more of a fight response. And they can't, so except at home.
Well, or they're protesting, and we're seeing all these anti-pandemic protests now because that's people mobilizing their fight response because of their, so it's complicated, right? It's a complicated.
So cultivate co-regulation and not co-dysregulation.
Yes, and this is where maybe we do another part 2, because I would love to talk a little bit about how do you support co-regulation in a time of pandemic when we're all having to be remote.
Yes. Let's do that.
Because this is what Porges talks about that. Porges talks about, well, how do you do that? And I've been doing a series of webinars recently on other topics, but during the webinars, we've been doing a lot of relational attunement and somatic co-regulation. And I'll give this as an example. I taught a training last week, 5 days, with people from all over the world. It was really lovely. And in spite of us all being in our respective homes, countries, continents, we were able to use the technology in such a way that we had a shared experience of group co-regulation on each of the days, where we were able to see each other's faces, have the social engagement, track each other's nervous systems, and feel a collective sense of connection and soothing. In spite of the geographic distance that's happening. And Porges recently did a webinar about the importance of social engagement during this time of pandemic to help with regulating all of this arousal and activation that's happening globally. And I'd like to see if we can talk a little bit more about the practicals of that now that we've covered the theory.
Okay. If you're up for a second, I definitely am. Thank you so much. I am so aware that you are really going to have to go. But
I do.
Yeah, okay, I will write to you and we will set that up. That would be wonderful.
We'll set that up. That'd be great, Amanda. I'd love to chat again, and we'll get really into the nitty-gritty of the practicals of how you can do that during this time.
Okay, so everybody out there in podcast land, wait for the second half. This is going to be so interesting. So Sarah, thank you very, very much. So that's it for another week. Huge thanks to Sarah for her vibrant store of knowledge. I have never taken so many notes in a podcast or written follow-up with many exclamation points so often. We will be back with part 2 as soon as Sarah and I can find the time to record it. In the meantime, thanks as ever to Caro C for the music at the head and foot of the podcast and for the sound production. Thanks to Faith Tilleray for designing the website and for being the other half of the creative team that is Accidental Gods. And thanks to you for listening. We would not be here without you. If you want to visit the website, we're at accidentalgods.life. That's where we have the show notes for this and all the other podcasts, the blog, and the entire prospectus of what Accidental Gods is trying to do in terms of facilitating conscious evolution. It's also where we have the membership program with a structured training designed to bring us all to the point where we can take our place in the web of life with integrity, authenticity, and groundedness. As far as the podcast goes, do subscribe. If you like what you hear, 5 stars and a review helps Google to take us seriously. But if we're going to reach more people, we will do it by word of mouth. So please do pass the link to anyone you know who wants the world to be a more generative and beautiful place. And until then, see you next week. Thank you and goodbye.